Hello everyone, welcome to Digital Photo Mentor Live. I've got my microphone in the wrong place. Let me fix that. This is the #1 place on the internet where you can learn how to edit photos via Lightroom, Luminar, and Photoshop and have some fun at the same time. Hopefully today. I've got a little bit of sniffles, so bear with me. I may be off camera for a good part, but I want to edit some subscriber images today. So these are images that were submitted by YouTube and email subscribers so that I could demonstrate my approach to editing, what I would do with them, and how to do things like basic edits, black and white conversion, and more complex editing like portrait and sky replacements. So I've got a variety of different images to work with today. If you would like to submit your images, just enter your information in the form. There's a link to the form in the description below the video, and submit a couple of images and you could see me editing your images next week. So I've got some really great things to show you today, and I'd love to get started. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If you're watching this on YouTube, the live chat, if you're watching live, is just to the side of the video. So tell us where you're watching from. I know there's a lot of regulars. We've got Anne and Nigel will probably join us. So let's get started. All right, can everybody see my Lightroom screen? You should be able to see Lightroom now. Anne is telling us it's an American long weekend. I think that was, well, it was long weekend for Canadians last week. So let's see what we've got today. So I've picked a few different images with a few different, let's just say, issues and challenges. I've got a few new people who've submitted some images. Let's take a look at this one first. This is by Annie, and I've already done a little bit of basic editing to this one. So I'm using Lightroom for this one. I'm going to reset. The original image was really dark and underexposed. So let's take a look. So a couple things here. So her settings were ISO 400 with a 135mm lens, so 200th of a second, and f5.6, right? So she's frozen the water, and let's see what camera. This is the advantage of sending me a raw file, because I can see all of your settings. I can see the camera that was used. This was a Nikon D5600. The lens that was used, everything. So I can also help if you're having any types of photography issues as well, because I have the metadata of the original file. So this one is a little bit or quite a bit underexposed, right? I was just going to look at what program she used. Okay, so shutter priority. All right. So the challenge with using shutter priority is exactly this. If you could share an article, please, Rob. I always put him on the spot. Rob is in the chat. If you could share an article on shutter speed, actually it's freezing and controlling motion, I believe, and it talks about that, and also the article on to shoot manual or not, and I talk about the different shutter and aperture priority modes. So the challenge with shutter priority mode is that you've selected the shutter speed of 200th of a second, and the camera can only choose what it can in terms of opening the aperture as far as the lens has the ability to open. So in this case, it's opened as wide as it can go to 5.6, and there wasn't enough light. Okay, so the image is very dark, as you can see by the histogram here on the upper right. There's basically half of the data is missing. So everything from medium gray to white, which is the right part of the graph, there's none. Okay, so that's how you can tell that it's quite underexposed. So shutter priority will allow you to underexpose. If you're shooting this scene and you see that your camera is flashing at you, okay, that it's trying to get your attention to say, look, hey, there's something going on here. You need to pay attention. In this case, she would have needed to increase the ISO. So if you're using ISO auto, that would help solve some of the exposure problems here. Okay. So to adjust it in processing, there's a couple of different things that we can do. Now, the first thing that happens is people go, okay, I need to adjust the exposure, so I'm going to hop over to the exposure slider. Okay, but if you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know that the exposure slider actually affects the middle of the graph or the midtones. Okay, so I can grab it from the exposure slider here, or you can actually grab it from the middle of the graph. Okay, now look what happens if I drag this all the way until I can sort of spread it out. The exposure is all the way at plus 1.9. So it's almost 2 stops underexposed. Okay, but if I do my little shift double click on the whites, so do it on the word. Okay, so I'm holding the shift key, double click on whites. Okay, look at how it spread out the graph a lot better without actually even touching the exposure slider. Now I'm just going to adjust the midtones, and I'm only at less than plus 1 here. Okay, so use the white slider. Whenever you have an image that's dark like this, use the white slider first, then exposure a little bit. Okay, in this case, I'm just going to dial the highlights down to pick up more detail in that foam. You can see that, right? And I might bring the shadows up. Okay, so that's lowering the contrast a little bit as well. If you want to check to make sure you're not clipping anything, you can press the J key on your keyboard, and that will activate highlight clipping warning. Or you can hold the Alt key and click the white slider. So you can see as I go higher, it clips, and then I bring it back down until I have no highlights clipping, right? So really quickly, we've gone from a dark image to one that has better exposure, right? So what I would do to further this, let me just zoom in as well here. I want to show you this at 100%, because even though this image was shot at, I forget already, 400 ISO, which is fairly low, you're going to start to pick up noise. I don't know if you can see that here. Let me zoom in even more. Right? So you can start to see this noise in the image, and that's because of pushing that exposure in the processing stage. Okay, so if you're shooting images at 100, 200 ISO and getting noise and wondering why, okay, make sure that your exposure is good out of camera, because when you push it, you're still going to get this problem with noise. Okay, so trying to avoid the noise by shooting a lower ISO but underexposing isn't going to work. Okay. So there's some cool things going on with this image, the foam from this little sort of water falling down here. So if we want to accentuate the foam, we can use texture and clarity. So I usually like to give almost every image a little bit of clarity. So let's go to about 20 on this one. And texture, now if I do texture overall, it's going to pick up texture everywhere, including this part down here, and you'll see that it adds more noise again. Okay, so the texture is enhancing the noise. So I don't want that. I just want the texture on these bubbles here. So I'm going to add a radial filter, and you can do that either from here on this little menu up here, or you can do it from here. Where am I? I never use these. I never go here because I use the keyboard shortcuts. You can go Tools and Radial Filter, or you can see that there's a keyboard shortcut shown here, which is Shift M. So that's the one that I usually use. So Shift M, and then you get this little crosshairs to draw your radial filter. Okay, so I'm just gonna make sure you can see it here. So it comes out as a circle, and you can change the size. So right now I've got some different adjustments happening to this area inside the circle, but I'm going to reset. So that's double click on the word effect. And I just want that texture that we were looking at earlier. So I'm going to bring the texture slider up and just make sure that I get it on these bubbles here and nowhere else. Okay, so if you want to see where your filter is applying, just press O. Okay, so that stands for overlay. And you'll see the red overlay show up to show you where the filter is applying. Okay, so you can see if I adjust this with the exposure that it's applying to this area only. Okay, and I'm just applying the texture. Can you see that? As I go minus texture, it gets blurry, plus texture, and I'm just affecting that area of the bubbles. Okay, because I don't want the texture all over the image to be increased, just that one area. Okay, so close it. And that's probably about all I would do to this image. I might also add a little edge vignette. Now I've got a few presets that I have made. Rob, if you could share the link to our presets, please. So these just add a quick vignette through the effects panel. You can see what it's doing there. It's just darkening the edges a little bit. Okay. So presets are just a way of getting to that point quicker with a one-click adjustment. Okay, if I choose a different one, you can see that it's changing the sliders here in the effects panel. Watch what happens when I click the other one. You can see that it's adjusting those settings. All right, let's continue with another one. I had an image of Anne's, and she's here, so I want to work on this one, because the first thing that I thought of when I saw this image was black and white immediately. And this is a question that has come up in previous weeks where somebody said, well, how do you know when an image should be converted to black and white? Or what are you seeing that makes a good black and white image? And in this case, I'm seeing not a lot of color, okay? So the image itself is fairly monochromatic. You know, there's a bit of blue in the sky, and there's a lot of contrast and shapes. So those kinds of things lend themselves well to black and white. One that I did on a previous week, let me see if I can find it here. There's one that I did which was black and white I did this one in black and white because I felt that it worked well with the antique train. And there was another one I did of the railroad tracks. I think I did that one a couple of weeks ago. Yes, this one. Okay, so this one I also converted to black and white because of the color is lacking color. There's not much color there to begin with, and that really sharp contrast of the railroad tracks. Okay, so those are a couple of things that I look for when I'm deciding to go black and white on an image, right? So now that I've decided to go black and white, I have a direction to go with this image. Okay. And Anne says that's what her final became. Excellent. So there you go. You're on the right track already. So the first thing I want to do actually is straighten it. So I'm going to use the crop tool, and I'm using the keyboard shortcut R. You can also click right here. And then I just click auto. Okay. So auto will then do a tilt correction. Right. The other way I can do this is in the transform panel. Right. There's a level which will then correct tilt, right? And you can also correct vertical adjustments, meaning if you're looking up at a building and you have some perspective control to be done, you can do that here in this panel, right? So vertical corrects any vertical distortion or perspective adjustments. Hey Rita, I've got one of your images coming soon. Hello to Manitoba. Okay, so now we've corrected the tilt. And the histogram looks pretty good. It's all evenly spread out. Let's check if there's anything clipping. Okay, so there's a little bit of highlights on the edges of the windows and so on clipping. I'm not going to worry about that so much. I'm going to do the black and white conversion first, and then we'll deal with those. Okay, so simply clicking on the black and white treatment up here will convert it to black and white. Okay. So there's a right way and a wrong way, or let's just say a better way and a good way and a better way to do black and white conversion. Okay, if you just change to saturation 0, you don't have any types of adjustments or ways of adjusting things. If you go into the HSL panel and you try and adjust any of the luminance like blue, so we know that the original sky was blue, it's not working because the image is now fully grayscale. Okay, so you've removed all the color. Right? If you go in and choose a camera profile, right? If you choose the monochrome one for the camera, you end up with the same problem because it's converted it, right? And there's no black and white adjustments that can be done. So the one that you want to use is the Adobe monochrome, and then you have this HSL panel. It used to say color in HSL, and now it says black and white mix. Okay, so that's what I want to work with. And I want to adjust the tones of the image, right? So I know that the sky was blue, right? If you're not sure, just hold down the / key so you can see the original, right? So I know that I want to darken the sky, right? Make sure you don't go too far, because what happens when you go too far is you get sort of these little halos happening. So I want to darken the sky and have some drama, but I don't want to create that halo. So I'm going to go part way. And I'm going to see if there's any cyan, because often there is in the sky as well. So there is, but look what's happening to these bottom windows. Okay, so as I go up and down with the cyan, it's darkening those windows. So I can decide if I want to darken them and leave them in the shadow. That actually works well. Or if I want to bring the light on the windows out a little bit, and then it's lightening the sky back up. Okay, so I have to decide which dance I want to do here. I think I'm going to go with darken, because I want to leave these parts in the shadow. Okay, so I'm darkening those. Now the other thing you can do with this panel is you have this little targeted adjustment tool here. Okay, so this is a little circle, and you click on it, and you get this little crosshairs and a little up and down symbol here. Okay, so now when I click somewhere in the image and drag, click and hold and drag up and down, it's going to adjust the tones of the original color that is underneath my mouse. Okay, so watch what happens when I click on the sky. Look at the sliders in the black and white mix. Okay, so remember when I move the blue slider, right, it's affecting the sky. So the same thing is happening when I'm clicking and dragging here. Okay, if I want to brighten the building, I'm going to do the same thing and do up. Okay, so I want to increase the contrast between the light and the dark. Okay, so I'm going to increase the brightness on the building, and you can see that that's orange and yellow. Okay, so it's increasing the orange and the yellow, and I'm going to go quite far with it because I want to really increase the contrast. And then we're going to come back and move down more with the sky. Okay, so a little bit of a dance with these colors. Okay, let's look at before. So that's how it was, just converting to black and white. And now I've adjusted the tones to give it more contrast. Okay. Going back to the basic panel, now we can look at, okay, is there anything clipping? Okay, so now I can see that there's a little bit of the windows and so on clipping. So I'm just going to use my Alt key, click on highlights, and drag it down until I get a little bit more detail in those areas. Now, if you have some highlights that are reflecting off of metal like this and you've got no detail, I'm not going to worry about it, because it's basically the edges of the windows here, the window frames, okay, that is clipping. All right, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit. I'm going to check my blacks. So with the blacks, you want to clip a little bit, so that's acceptable. I can bring the whites down if I want a little bit, but I'm going to actually leave it because I like the contrast. There we go. And in fact, I might even give it a little bit more contrast. And let's see if I can bring those shadows. So if I bring the shadows up, I'm lowering the contrast. This is darkening, okay? So I actually want to increase the contrast and then just a little bit more exposure. Okay, so let's look at that. So before and after. So I'm really using those tools in the black and white mix to adjust the tones to give me more contrast. I'm going to add that edge vignette again. And what I might do with this image is remove this pipe here, right? Because this pipe is sort of bugging me. And Lightroom is not the best tool for doing major cloning, so I would probably hop over to either Luminar, honestly, or Photoshop to do this. But I'm going to try and see if Lightroom does a decent job. And what I find, if you're trying to do a complicated clone in Lightroom, okay, so I'm using the cloning tool, is do it bit by bit, especially when you have something like this. Okay, so I want to get rid of, all of this part here. I want to make sure that I'm on heal 100%. Okay, so that's still getting a little bit of that stick showing up, and I just want to do it a little by little. Okay, so I'm moving around the targeted tool here. Let's try clone as opposed to heal. Let's try this one on clone. When I'm dealing with an area that's very similar like this, clone might work better. Okay, you see what I mean? Like, it's not doing a great job, right? So I would either hop over to Photoshop and remove this, or try it in Luminar, because Luminar does a pretty good job, right? Oops. All right. So that's what I would do with that image. East Vancouver. Yes, I could see that type of building in East Vancouver. Absolutely. Okay, so what I'm looking at in this image, again, when I started, is the stark contrast here, the lack of color. So I've turned it to black and white. I might even crop in a little bit tighter on this side to get rid of this thing on the side here. About like that. And watch your edges as well, so that you're not sort of cropping in the middle of windows like this. If you're going to crop, come in between the windows maybe. So let's see what this looks like as a tall vertical. Okay, so there's a perfect example of what I mean by watch your cropping. So when I cropped, see that little stick of white still there on the edge? So I want to go a little bit more to get rid of that. Okay, so just watching your edges. And now that I've done that, it still looks a little bit crooked to me. So I'm going to straighten it a little bit. Okay. So there is kind of a cool, strong, vertical panoramic image. Is there a paint option in Lightroom? In terms of what do you want to paint, Anne? You can use the adjustment brush to do painting of things, but tell me what it is you want to paint in, like paint in color. So you can kind of do that, but if you've changed it to monochrome, paint out the pole. No, you can't paint out the pole. You have to do cloning. Okay, so that's this cloning tool right here, right up here. So cloning or healing. Yeah, paint out, no, they don't have something called paint out. It's called cloning or spot removal, right, in Lightroom. If you go over to Luminar, it's called erase. Or you go to Photoshop and you can use various different things. So if you want to see me erase this in Photoshop, let's just edit this in Photoshop. Well, let's do it both ways, okay? So I'll open it in Photoshop. Hey, Nigel's here. No worries, Nigel. Glad you could join us from the Bahamas. No, Barbados. Barbados? Okay, so it's taking a second while we're opening Photoshop here. And see how you guys are doing in the chat. All right. Okay, so now I have Photoshop open, right? And then I have all my tools for Photoshop on my second monitor. So I'm just going to grab, there's a couple of things you can do here, okay, to remove this pole. I will copy the layer, okay, I'm going to move my tools over here. I will copy the layer, so I'm not editing the original layer. And you could try the patch tool, okay, so that's this guy right here. And with the patch tool, what you do is you drag a selection around the thing you want to get rid of. And then you can choose here, you could choose it to be target or source. And what I'm going to do is just drag this up here, and it's going to try and do its magic and fill it in. Right, now look what happened. It did a really good job. Okay, so the patch tool was super quick and easy to do that. Okay, so I'll demonstrate it again. Just, oops, I'm still selected. Right, so I'm going to deselect. So just select the patch tool. That's this one here. Looks like a patch on denim or something. Carefully select the area. Now I'm just drawing a circle around it. Okay, and then I just dragged it up and let Photoshop try and fill it in. Okay, so it's using content aware fill here. Okay, so that's important. It's using content aware fill, which means that it's going to analyze the bits around this area and try and fill it in. Okay, and it did a great job. So then we could look at, is there anything else I want to clean up while I'm in here, right? And fix. So do any of that stuff while you're in Photoshop. Maybe we want to get rid of these guys here. Okay, so I'll just show sort of the various different ways of cloning, right? So inside of Photoshop, you have the stamp tool, right? You've got the patch tool, and then you've got these healing brushes, okay? So there's one healing brush where you just draw over the spot, and it does content aware or proximity, okay? So I'm using content aware here. And proximity match, meaning it's matching around the area. So I literally just draw over the spot that I want to erase, and it fills it in. You can also use the other healing brush where you select a spot. Let's see. This is pretty clean, so I'm just trying to find an example for you here of what I can clone out. Okay, so let's say I want to clone this window highlight out for whatever reason. Okay, so the first time I go to click with this brush, it asks me to define the source point. Okay, so to define the source point, I have to option click. Okay, so it's telling me that. So I'm holding option and I'm going to click down here. So as soon as I click option, it changes to a different little target. So it's clicking, I click there, and now you can see that when I move my brush around, it's going to pick from that spot that I chose. Okay, so when I paint here, okay, and I can set the mode of the brush as well, so I can set it to lighten, darken, and so on. Okay, so if I want to darken this little windowsill here, I'm going to choose an area down here in the dark. Okay, so now I've chosen this area, and then I'm going to paint up here. Okay, so see how it just chose from this area below and painted darkening there. So that's obviously not a very good job, but that's how that tool works. Okay, the stamp tool works very similar. You need to choose a target. Okay, and then I can choose darken here as well. Oops, I can choose darken here as well. And I'm just going to make my brush small. Okay, so then when I go in, I can choose my opacity. I'm setting that to 30%. And now I've chosen, see how it's choosing the spot below in the dark? Can you see there's a spot down below with a little crosshairs? So it's cloning from that area into where I'm painting, where you can see my green cursor. Okay, so all I did there was I just darkened that spot on the windowsill. So I didn't remove it. I used the cloning tool, set to darken, to gradually sort of paint it in. Okay, so that's what Anne, I think, was talking about in terms of painting. So if I wanted to do a lot of this kind of work, I could go in and use the cloning and stamping and cloning tool. Okay, this one here. Okay, clone stamp tool, to basically just darken certain areas a little bit. Okay, set to darken mode. Right. So now that we're happy with that, I'm just going to hit save. And when I close it, we'll go back to Lightroom. And then we'll see that we have a new image now popping up in Lightroom because I opened it into Photoshop as a plugin. Right? So there's Anne's original image. And then in a second, it will pop up with the new one. There we go. Okay? So you can see the original image still had the line there. And the edited image, which is now a Photoshop document or PSD, right, is gone. So quick edits over to Photoshop, right? Awesome. Nice tools. Okay, so if you're not familiar with those tools, hopefully that gives you a great idea on how to use them. You can also use the erase tool in Luminar, and it will do a really nice job there as well. Okay, now I know Rita is watching, and I've got a couple of her images today. So I want to do one of hers. I know she sent me this really cool flowered image. So I love this image because it's backlit and the flowers look fantastic. Okay, when I zoom in, you can see that they're quite sharp. Okay, so I want to do a couple of different edits on this one because I think it has lots of potential. It's really pretty to begin with. Okay. Now you'll notice that if I look at this image and look at what's clipping, the background is clipping, meaning there's no detail there. However, she's made an artistic choice here, which I agree with. So she's overexposed the image. So if you look at the histogram, it looks overexposed, but she's done that to get the proper exposure on the flowers. Okay, because if she had exposed it correctly, okay, look at the histogram to make sure you get lots of detail in the background, the flowers are now underexposed, right? So she's exposed it correctly for the subject matter. So good job, Rita. Okay, so what I want to bring out here are these flowers and the color, okay? So a couple of things I want to do first, okay? So I always go and look at the camera profile, and that's this guy up here at the top. And we can just see if I choose a different camera profile. So it's on camera neutral right now. And she photographed this with a Canon Rebel. Okay, so it's on camera neutral on the camera profile. But let's see what happens if I choose some of the others. Okay, so standard, just by hovering over, you see that I get more color, and I haven't done anything, just choosing that profile. Portrait generally has a lot of red in it, and in this case, that might work well because the flowers are red. Okay, landscape tends to punch up golds and greens and so on. Okay, so that one works well also. So look at the difference here. Just by choosing standard or portrait or landscape, we can automatically get more color, and I think I'm liking the standard one. Okay, so that's got some nice color, and I haven't done anything to saturation, none of the sliders. Okay, just camera profile. So do go and play with your camera profiles, right? There's a question. Is the camera profile specific to the camera itself? Will different cameras result in different options in Lightroom? Yes. So because this is a Canon camera, okay, the Lightroom, the program recognizes the camera, and these profiles go with that camera. Okay. If I look at one of my images, let me just see here. Just find something quick here. Okay, so these are one of my images from Italy, for example. Okay, so this is shot with a Fuji camera. You'll see that the camera profiles in here look very different. Okay, so now I have Astia, Classic Chrome, Eterna, Provia. Those are Fuji profiles. Okay, so very different indeed. To get back to where I was. There we go. All right. Okay, so the first thing I want to do after adjusting the profile is crop it a little bit. Okay, the flower is dead center, and there's these little ones over here on the right. So I want to make this main focus flower off center a bit more. And there's a lot of what you would call negative space around it. And I'm just going to free crop, so I'm not going to worry about the aspect ratio. I'm just going to crop it to what I think looks best for this image. Okay. So I'm going to come down a little bit. Now we can play around with cropping into the red flowers here and see how that looks. But I want to get rid of some of this white space on the left. And I might even want to come in on the bottom a tiny bit because the stem, there's a lot of stem. Okay, so let's see what happens if we go with something like that. Okay. So now it's kind of got an asymmetrical balance. Okay. You want to do that in Luminar? I will show you that next, Rita, because I'm actually going to do this image twice. I'm going to do it in Lightroom, and then I'm going to do it in Luminar. Okay, so I will show you that. All right. So I like the balance that's happening here now. It's what's called like an asymmetric. So think of a old school playground teeter-totter. If you have one child that's bigger and one child that's smaller, you can still balance them on the teeter-totter by shifting it one side or the other. Now I'm dating myself, right? The other thing that you can do is the stem is straight up and down. And I showed this in an image that I did a couple weeks ago where I tilted, right, the image, rotated it in cropping to adjust the composition. Okay, so if I want to get this stem more diagonal, I can play around with this type of cropping. That's probably too far, but let's just see how it looks for effect here. Right. Okay, now we have a little bit more of a diagonal, which gives more sort of dynamic feel to an image. Lines that are straight up and down or straight horizontal feel very static. Ones which are diagonal feel like there's more movement. Okay, so really quickly, just a crop and a profile change, we've done an enormous good to this image. If you want more color, okay, here's another little trick. So I'm going to do my shift, double click on the blacks, okay, so the word blacks, and it's going to set the black point so that it touches the edge of the graph, right? So it's added a lot of black, probably more than I want, but look what happens to the color saturation, okay? So if you find that your images are lacking color, it probably means that you need to add some black. So let's take a look at the slider with the Option key held down. So Alt Option, hold it down, bring the slider to the left. So what I'm looking for is a little bit of black clipping in this case here, just like that. And I actually like the white clipping because it's giving a really nice high key background. So I might actually even push that up to increase the contrast a bit more, right? And scale back just a tiny bit on that black. So let's keep that nice and soft, right? Not a lot that I would do to this image. So I've just done a few minor changes. We could also add a light vignette, right? So I'll show you that. So when you're adding an edge vignette, which in Lightroom is under the effects panel, you can go to the left to darken, or you can go to the right to whiten. So you can actually make this a really soft, sort of dreamy image with whitening out the edges here, okay? Just like so. So I really like that. Now the one thing that's sort of bugging me is this little green bud down here. Right, so I don't know that I would want to clone it out completely, but we can use the adjustment brush here in Lightroom and just double click effect, the word effect, to reset. And what I want to do is lighten it. So I'm going to bring shadows up, I'm going to bring exposure up, and let's just see how that goes. Okay, so I'm going to paint with about 50% opacity on this little guy here, and I'm just going to try and lighten it. Okay, so now it's actually bringing some red out. Do you see that? As soon as I lightened, where am I getting red from? Interesting. So as soon as I lightened it, it brought the red out. So that there is a little flower there. Let's turn the saturation down a little bit because I actually don't want the red. Like so. Okay, so I'm trying to sort of minimize this effect of this guy here, and I'm just playing around with the settings. So I'm going to lower the contrast. I might bring the clarity down a little bit, right? Like so. It's just sort of, let's see what happens when I zoom out here. Turn it off. See how it's just sort of dark, and now it blends in a little bit nicer with a soft red color. So I'm looking for things that stand out. In that case, that dark green didn't go with the colors of the rest of the image. Okay? So that's probably all I would do with this image. We could increase the warmth if you want to bring out more of the red. You can try the temperature slider as well, because the more warmth you add, right, they're going to get sort of more orangey looking. Okay? Or playing with more pink. So you can really adjust the color of the flowers by using these sliders. Okay? But it's a beautiful image to start with, and a few little tweaks here and there, and you've got something really pretty and like a fine art, okay, image. As Rob mentioned in the chat, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Once you've subscribed to the channel, you will get notices of new videos when they are published. Okay? Let's take a look at the same image in Luminar. Okay, so as Rita mentioned, she uses Luminar. So we're going to open this same image, right? So notice that a couple of things. So you'll see that even though I did the editing here in Lightroom, when I go and look at the raw image in Luminar, it's unedited, okay? Why is that? Anybody know the answer to that? It's a bit of a trick question, okay? Because when you are editing your raw images in Lightroom, okay, you're not actually making any changes to the file. All you are doing is creating a recipe that Lightroom stores in the catalog, and only when you go to export that image will you apply that recipe and make a new image. Okay, so here's the raw file in Luminar, and it's still untouched. Okay, so the first thing I want to do in Luminar, actually I'll show Rita where to find those profiles. So if you go into the Essentials tools under the Light panel, Profile is right there. Okay, so remember the one that I used over on the other side? I think I used the standard one. Right, you can see the same thing happens here. I can just change that profile. Let's do the landscape one, and you can see that as I move my mouse over them, right, I'm getting the same. You can see it preview. Okay, so standard, landscape gives more color. Actually, I like landscape over here. Okay, it's doing some weird stuff with the tonality over here, but we'll fix that. Landscape. Okay, let's use landscape. So I'm going to work with some of the AI tools in here just to see what Lightroom, Luminar, just to see what Luminar's AI or artificial intelligence wants to do. So Accent AI is a great one to start with. So that's under the first tool, Enhance, and just slide it up. So you can see what's happening is it's doing lots of great things on the flowers, punching up the colors, right? But it's doing it to the whole image. So I don't want that to apply to the whole image. So what I'm going to do is bring it up to where I want it on the flower and then apply a mask. Okay, so in Luminar, the mask is here. And I'm going to make sure I have a soft brush. I'm going to bring my opacity down a little bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint it in. Okay, so you can paint the mask in or erase it. So painting in means that I'm going to take this effect that's applying with this filter and paint it onto where I want it to apply. And I'm going to do that here because I just want it on this flower. Okay, so as I paint, you see that it's showing up sort of with the red overlay. So it's only applying on this flower. Okay, I don't want it anywhere else. Let's turn this tool off so you can see it's just applying on the flower. Right? Sky Enhancer is interesting because it's assuming that the white is a sky in the background. Okay, so it's picking up sky, which is interesting in itself because we might be able to hop over to sky replacement and see if it'll actually put a different sky in there. I'm curious about that. Okay, so let's do a crop. Okay, so in Luminar AI, they have composition AI as well. So I'm just going to click the button and it's going to decide on a composition or cropping for me. Okay, now what I find often happens is that the amount of cropping is exactly what I would do, but I just need to move it around. Okay, so it's cropped this much, and if you take a look, it's very similar to what I did on the other image in Lightroom. Okay, I'm gonna make sure that I can go free on this one. Okay, because it tends to keep the aspect ratio, and then I'm gonna do the tilt. Did I tilt this way or did I tilt this way? I forget now. Okay, let's tilt this way. Well, yes, I think I tilted that way. Okay, and then just hit enter. So now we've got something similar to what we had happening over in Lightroom. Okay, before and after. And let's take a look at what other things we can do in here. Some more AI. Let's see what Sky AI. So it does tell us that we can put a sky in here. Okay, so if I choose a sky, it's going to most likely put it into that background. No, it's not popping it in there. Oh, there we go. So if you want, you could actually replace the sky on this, which is actually not that bad. So we can play around with this and put in a blue sky behind your flowers, right? So there's a little bit of tweaking I would probably do to this because the sky needs to be out of focus, right? The background is out of focus, so I would do that. But it's an interesting idea. So not saying that I would agree with that, but it's an interesting option to have, okay? So if you want to get rid of the white background, you can go with the blue, right? Now that's kind of cool, right? Let's see, let's defocus it a little bit more. The defocus is great because you'll notice that these flowers are out of focus. So the sky, which is, back at infinity, would not be in focus. So to make it look more realistic, we need to make sure that the sky is blurred as well if we're doing a sky replacement, right? Right, so I can also brighten it a little bit, make the sky bluer, and so on. Right, interesting option. Right, let's just turn that guy off for now. Actually, let's leave it on. And let's play around with some other options. Okay, so the thing that I love about Luminar is that it gives you a lot more tools to create sort of a look, okay? Actually, I will turn that off. If you're not sure where to start with your image, hop over to templates. So even though we've done some basic adjustments already to it, we can take a look at the templates that are being suggested, right? So it knows that it's something in nature, right? It knows that it's maybe a macro image. And I'm just kind of scrolling through to see what type of effects look good on this. Now, I like this image a lot, this little template, best close-up. Look at what it's doing on the flower, right? So you can actually dial the template down, meaning everything that's applied will dial down. And I can also go in and do some brushing in to make sure that it's not on the background in different places, right? But that one makes the flower really stand out nicely, right? Let's see what objects do. Okay, so it knows that, again, it's an object, it's a still life. I mean, this one is adding some grain, which is kind of cool. Right? That's different again. So you have to decide, do you want something that's really sharp and punchy and vibrant in terms of saturation for this image? Okay? In which case you want to do something like this. Or do you want something like this one that's going to the other side, muted and soft? Okay? I do like the color for this image, but I think that it's nicer, softer in a way, because the flower flowers are soft, right? They're kind of, feminine and so on. Now this one is interesting because it gives you this really backlit grainy look, which I really like actually. So I'm going to use that one and just dial it down a little bit. Okay, so you can see that as I'm moving this slider at the bottom, okay, so the preset's called Quirky Mo in the Filmatic collection, and it's dialing it down as I go down. So everything that's being applied is being sort of softened, right? Then you can go into edit and tweak them all. And you'll be able to know which things have been applied from this template because they have a little dot next to them. Okay, so there's been some light, color, glow, film grain, and it looks like some portrait stuff has been applied, right? So we can actually probably turn those off because there's no people in this image, right? So we can just undo those. Undo, there we go. And take a look at what it has applied. So it's applied a glow, right? Look at that, it's glowing on the outer part. I'll turn that up a little bit more. Yes, nice. Okay, so let's see what that does. Okay, so glow takes white parts of your image and makes them glow. Okay, so you notice that the flower's not glowing so much, but the white parts are. And in this case, I think that works really well with this image as well. So it enhances that feeling of the backlight situation. Right? Film grain, it's added some film grain so that you can sort of see in the petals here once it gets sharp on the screen. It looks more like, film grain is different than noise, right? I find that film grain is more pleasing. It feels nicer, like this looks nice to me and soft, right? So I've just turned it up even more so you can see it. And the other thing I might do is Mystical, which is my favorite filter. If you've watched me edit before, right? It adds sort of an overall softness. And I'm going to dial that glow back a little bit so it's glowing just a bit too much. Okay, so let's do before and after. Okay, so we've done a very different edit in here than we did in Lightroom. Okay. Now, this little leaf thing is bugging me again, so let's take a look at the erase tool in Luminar and see if it can do a good job of actually removing this whole thing. Okay, I'm just going to make the brush a little bigger. So literally, to remove things in Luminar, you just paint over them, right? And make sure you get a little bit around the edge so it can sort of interpret what's there. And then just click erase and wait. Okay, so it's going to use AI or artificial intelligence to analyze the image, just like Photoshop did with the patch tool. Okay, so now it didn't do so great, but it's not too bad, okay? It's not bad at all. I could actually clone out this whole stem. So I'm just going to undo. So that's Control, Command Z or Z, and clear the selection. And I'm just going to do it part by part. Okay, so I'm going to try it on this side first. So I tried the whole thing, didn't quite work. I'm going to do it bit by bit and see if it does a better job if I do it part by part. Okay, so now you can see that that worked better. Okay, so I'll probably just do a little bit more on this side. And see if I can do a good job with that. Okay, if I'm not happy with this, I'll just undo the erase tool and try the clone tool. It's not too bad. It's done a good job here, but I would have to do a lot of work to fix this up here. So I'm actually going to undo that and just use the cloning tool, which they have in Luminar as well. Down at the bottom of the professional tools. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So this is one where you have to select the source, right? So I'm going to clone from just below, and I'm going to use a lower opacity, and then I'm just going to paint up. So I'm putting my source below, and then I'm just painting up. Okay, so see what it's doing is it's painting white up into the green areas. I'm just doing slight clicks here. So pick a new source. Paint in. Oops, see? Double clicked. And I'm going to search again here. So it's a matter of doing it slowly to remove it. Okay? So the cloning tool is doing a better job here. And I'm just doing it little by little. Okay? So then I might go from the top as well, like so. Okay. Go up the stem. I'm doing a very bad job of this because I'm trying to do it quickly here. But what I would do is do it a little bit slower and go piece by piece again. Okay, so the tools inside of Luminar for cloning are pretty decent. They're better than Lightroom, but not as good as Photoshop. Okay, so if you really want to do a proper job of removing that, I would go to Photoshop. But there's also tools you can use in here just to lighten. Okay, so if I want to just lighten this guy, I can do local masking. Okay, add a basic layer. So it's kind of like a layer. I'm going to increase the exposure and the shadows like I did on the other one. And I'm just going to paint it in on this flower. Okay, so as soon as I paint, you can see that it's only applying here on this little leaf guy. Like so. So I'm just lightening him so he's not so obvious. Okay. Dial that back a little bit. Perfect. Okay, so very different look that we have here as compared to what we did in Lightroom. But you've got a really great image here, Rita, and I think you've got lots of room to try different things with it. You could even try a black and white. I love the color because the flowers are so vibrant. But if you try black and white, you might be able to do something interesting there as well. Okay. I'm not a super fan of, what they call selected color. But the one thing that I do like in Luminar that you can't do in Lightroom is you can go into the color tool and paint in effects like HSL, right? Let's see what that template applied here. Okay, so it actually dialed down the red. All right. So I could take the saturation of red, for example, and let's say I want to desaturate the reds. And you can see what that's doing. It's doing to the whole image. But maybe I just want to do that on the background flowers so that they are less bright and vibrant, and the attention goes to the main flower. So once again, we can mask it and just paint in this tool where we want it. Okay, and I love the HSL tool in Lightroom, and I use it a lot. But a pet peeve of mine is that you can't paint it in, right? So you can do lots of things with the adjustment brush and the adjustment tools in Lightroom, but you can't paint in the HSL tool. Okay, so see how that is affecting just that background one, right? So I've painted that in. You can see just on the background flowers, maybe not quite so much desaturation, like so. Right? There we go. All right, let's just hop back over here. Let me see how you guys are doing. There I am. Okay. So I'm curious to see what you did with the image, Rita. I would love it if you shared in the group. I'm not even sure if you're in our DPM Facebook group or if you're on Facebook, but you can share an image with us in the group. Rob, can you share a link to the Facebook group, please? Okay. Anne says, so many variations, you could spend hours on one photo. And see, that's the thing, like, I actually really love photo editing for that reason, because it's all about experimenting and what works and what doesn't work. And half the time I end up playing around with an image like this because there are so many possibilities, right, that you can come up with 3 or 4 different variations of the same image. Okay. I'll hop back over to Lightroom here, because I want to show you, if you want to make different variations in Lightroom, you can do so easily by making what's called a virtual copy and then edit it differently. Okay? So you can just right click and choose create virtual copy, or the keyboard shortcut is actually Command apostrophe. So when I do that, what happens is you can see that there's now a new thumbnail, so that you can see 2 of the images, but it's just a new thumbnail. So it hasn't duplicated the entire image. It's just made another thumbnail inside of Lightroom so that you can play around with it. Okay. So if you want to do a black and white version, or maybe you want to do like a sepia tone, which is in the toning. Now the color grading in Lightroom, I'm actually not a fan of their new color grading. I liked it when it was split toning before. Okay. So you can make something that's more of like a sepia tone, like so. And now we have 2 versions of the file, 2 versions of the image. You can then export both of them and have a color and a black and white version spit out of Lightroom. Okay, but as I mentioned, the original raw file is still unedited. Okay? Same thing with Luminar. Once you're finished, you need to export it to make a new image. Okay. All right, how are we doing here? Let's see. Okay, I wanted to bring up these images of Terrence here. So Terrence looks like he shot these in a zoo, and there's some bars here. Okay, so can you see this right here? It's a little bit more obvious on this one. So it looks like he's shooting through the bars, okay, into the enclosure for this animal. So a couple things I want to mention in terms of shooting. When you're shooting something like this, you want to make sure that you get a lot closer to the actual bars, because then they will disappear. Okay, so if you are having your lens literally touching the bars, these will go away. Okay, the other thing is that the shutter speed you want to watch, now I think Rob shared this one earlier, but maybe you can find it again, is that shutter speed article, freezing and blurring motion. He's using a 78mm lens here, but the 30th of a second shutter speed. Okay, so you want to make sure that your shutter speed is at least the same as your focal length or faster. Okay, because what's happened is we've got some camera shake because of the low shutter speed. Okay, so you can see that it's not completely sharp, this image. And let's see the other one. Okay, 100th of a second. Okay, so now it's better. We've got 1/100, which is faster than the focal length. Okay, 78. And it definitely looks sharper, but probably could still stand to be a little bit sharper yet. Right? So you want to really work on getting sharper images. There's another article for you to find, please, Rob, getting sharper images. So where your dot goes on the subject, you want to make sure that you're choosing single point focus and that you place it on the subject, in this case, the animal's face. So because it looks to me, as I scroll around here, that the rocks or his feet down here, which are behind his face, are sharper than the actual face, okay? So in terms of editing this type of image, it's very difficult to get rid of things like these bars. And I showed this to Rob yesterday, and he said he didn't see this little bar here until I cropped it. Now, this one is not too bad. You could probably get away with it because it's not super visible, right? But I would crop that to get rid of the bright areas, and then do my usual thing with my shift double click. I've already added some blacks, and then I'm going to bring up the exposure. Also going to warm this image up a little bit. Right? Now keep in mind this is a JPEG as well, so editing this is not going to, it's not going to allow me to go as far with the editing process because it's a JPEG as if it was versus a raw file. Okay. So what I would do there is literally just punch up the whites and the blacks, and we could bring it a little bit of clarity and texture to bring out that cat. Okay. Something else I would do is I did add a slight vignette already. Okay, so I think I added the low or the medium vignette, and that applies here in the effects tool, post crop vignette. But I want to really focus in on the cat's face. So I'm going to use a radial filter. Okay, you can do that here, or Shift M. And I'm going to double click because I want to lower the exposure and the highlights. And what's going to happen is I want to apply it on the opposite of where the circle is. Okay, so you can see that right now it's darkening the cat. And all I have to do is invert it so that it's now applying outside the circle. Okay, but to see what that did, when I switched that, look at how immediately your attention now goes to the cat. Okay, because I'm eliminating things in the background like highlights and darkening, so that your eye goes directly to the cat. Okay, let me turn this off. See the difference? So whenever you want to do effectively an off-centered vignette in Lightroom, you need to use this radial filter. Okay. The neat thing about doing the same thing in Luminar, if I go and find that image, right, let's see how Luminar thinks we should crop this one. Be curious to see if it crops all that stuff out that I did. Okay, so I just click the purple button. Okay, reposition. I'm going to crop even a little bit more. So I'm going to go free on this one. Like so. All right, like that. We'll give them space to look. So if I want to do a vignette in Luminar, the neat thing is that you can change the positioning of it. Okay, so I'm darkening the vignette, and I turn my feather down to 0, adjust the size. I can change how round it is and so on. Let's make it really small like I did on the other one. And then I can position it. Okay, so the beautiful thing about Luminar is this is very similar to using the radial filter, but I can do it right in the vignette tool and move it around. And then when I get it where I want it, just adjust the feather so it's soft. Okay. Inner light also allows me to brighten the inside at the same time as darkening the outside. Okay, so if I wanted to do that inside of Lightroom, I need 2 radial filters, one on the outside of the circle and one on the inside. Okay, so hopping back to Lightroom, okay. If I want a second to brighten the animal, okay, I just have to right click, duplicate it, invert it, and then apply my effects. So there's a lot more work to do it inside of Lightroom actually than there is in Luminar. Okay, so Luminar allows me to do the light on the cat at the same time as darkening the outside. Okay, so that's what I would do to that image. And then if you wanted to do some cleaning up of it, okay, so when I talk about cleaning up an image, right, I'm talking about things like this in the background where there's this little sort of smudgy thing here, whatever that is on the wall. So I want to get rid of that. I'm using heal, right? if I had spots, I could try and get rid of like spots of brightness. I could clone those out as well. This little stick here, again, you could try and clone that out with Lightroom, but it's not going to do a great job. The cloning tool is not the greatest in Lightroom. Let's see if we can do it in Luminar. And so she likes the comparisons that I'm doing the same image in Lightroom and Luminar. I like to do it as well because a lot of the things that I'm doing in Lightroom are actually a lot easier in Luminar. Right? Remember I said this image wasn't so sharp? Let's actually zoom in, okay, and take a look at the animal's face. So he's not super sharp to begin with. But I'm going to add some sharpening. And in Luminar, you have a choice of adding small, medium, or large details. And I find that when you add the small details, look at the face, right? It's actually sharpened the face really nicely, okay? So what I want to do is bring this up quite high, and then I'm just going to apply it just to the cat, okay? Again, with a mask. So I mask a lot. I'm just going to paint this in to make his face look sharper. Right, so painting sharpness in on the kitty cat. Who else is kitty cat fans? We have 2 cats in our household, and we are the staff members for them, of course. So cats have staff, dogs have owners, right? So now let's see what this is doing. Right, so it's really sharpening the cat up, but without sharpening the whole rest of the image. Now let's compare to Lightroom again. I'm going to zoom in, and let's see what we can do with detail and sharpening in Lightroom. Okay, sharpening, you don't have the options that you do in Luminar, and look what happens if I sharpen. Right, I can't paint this in. I can just use their masking slider, and if I paint this in, or if I add the sharpening to a really high degree here, let's go to 200%, it doesn't look so good. Okay, so that's what happens when I drag the sharpening up. I start to get these artifacts. Okay, that's what's called JPEG artifacts versus Luminar. Let's look at 200%. What I've done was with the sharpening and the small details, you are starting to get some of that artifacts, but I find that the image just looks sharper in Luminar, and it does a better job of the sharpening. Okay, so if you find that you do have images that are not sharp like this, try Luminar versus Lightroom. The sharpening is better. Or if you have Topaz Sharpen AI, that's a great one to use as well. I demonstrated that one a couple of weeks ago on sharpening some photos of a rhino. Right? So that's what I would do with our kitty cat. Okay, how are we doing here? All right. Yes, cats train humans very well. Anne says they do train us. Absolutely. Our cat last night stole a Smoky off the counter that was under a plate. She steals a hamburger, which is thawing in the sink in a bucket of water. She is a meat thief. All right, next, let's see. So just to finish up with Terrence's images, this one is going to be a lot harder to remove those bars because they're so prominent and so out of focus. You'd have to do a lot of cloning, and that would definitely be a Photoshop thing. Okay, so you'd have to do a lot of work to clone out these bars. So you really want to work at getting as close to them as you can, and minimizing the bars when you're shooting. Okay, it would also help if you use a slightly longer image, but make sure that you have your shutter speed nice and high, right? All right, let's see. Okay, so we've done this one. Just marking for myself here so I know which ones we've worked on. Okay, a couple of quick ones. This one here from Regender. Actually, I believe it was Regender's rhinos that we worked on before. Now, I've already done a bit of editing on this one in Lightroom. Let me just show you the before. Okay, so the before image looks like it was either like hazy or smoky or smoggy or something when it was shot. Okay, so what I did in Lightroom, okay, I have to like concentrate on saying Lightroom or Luminar, is I've added the whites and the blacks. Okay, I'm just going to reset it and I'll show you how I got there. Okay. So when we look at the original image, look at this histogram, okay? It's dead smack in the center, okay? Which is what your camera does when it reads the scene and meters for you. It definitely puts it in the middle or medium gray. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with this exposure. It's just a very flat scene because of this haziness or smokiness, okay? So this is where I use my shift double click, okay? So hold the shift key, double click on the word whites, double click on the word blacks, and within 2 clicks we have this, okay? So what that does, you see, is it stretched out the histogram, it stretched out the graph so that it's now touching both ends. Now I have pure white and I have pure black. Right? We can also play with the camera profile here. Let's see if landscape or some of these others give us a bit more color. Okay, I definitely like landscape. And I'm going to warm it up a little bit. Okay, so this was shot at 5,000 Kelvin. So I'm going to increase that. So we can actually make it much more fall colors. Maybe get rid of some magenta. Okay. Like so. Okay, so very quickly we've punched up the contrast and the color. Okay, so remember when I said about adding black? That's where you get the contrast and your color saturation from, right? The other thing that I want to do here, we can add some clarity. You can also work with the dehaze slider. Okay, so dehaze does pretty much similar to what I just did with the whites and the blacks, but I have less control. Okay, so see how it actually does exactly the same thing, but I've done it with the blacks and the white sliders because now I control how much I'm going either direction, okay, towards black or towards white. But we can add a bit more, we can add a bit of clarity, okay, like so. Sorry, I got the sniffles today. All right, let me take the same image in Luminar. So if you're liking this comparison, let's keep going. So I'm just going to start with this one in the very first filter, which is Enhance AI. And they put that one at the top because it's a suggested place to start, okay? So I'm going to pull up Accent AI and just see what it does, okay? Right off the bat, does a pretty good job. Then I'm going to go into the landscape tool because I know that dehaze is in here, okay? And I'm just going to see what dehaze does. Okay? Look at that. And it does a way better job than Lightroom does in terms of dehazing. Let's do a foliage enhancer because there's lots of foliage here. I do find that the foliage enhancer tends to be too bluish green. So I like to drag this color over here a bit more. And I'm going to go golden hour, which gives it a little bit more yellow. And then I'm going to go up into the light panel. Now I did an entire video on how to use curves. And you can see, I'm going to bring up the histogram. So we looked at the histogram in Lightroom. And we've got the same thing here. I did view histogram in Luminar. You can also see it in the background of the curves. Okay, so I'm in the light tool in the curves section. Okay, and if I want to increase those blacks and whites, all I have to do is drag that over until it literally comes to meet the edge of the graph. So I'm using the dots at the bottom here, okay, until it starts to meet the graph. So now I've done the same idea as I did with Lightroom, okay? If I want to see if I've got anything clipping, I just hit the J key as well. And I still don't, so I want a little bit more clipping. I want some more blacks. Let's go farther. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so now you can see there's a little bit of clipping here in the white trees. So I'm going to bring the highlights down or back off just a bit on this white slider, like so. Smart contrast is another great slider that has some AI or artificial intelligence behind it. So if I use the smart contrast filter, right, you can see what it's doing in terms of punching that up. There's another tool inside of Luminar that I love, again, that doesn't exist in Lightroom, right? And that is down at the bottom here. It's called super contrast. So it's under the professional tools, right? And it allows me to adjust highlights, midtones, and shadows contrast separately, right? So it's great. So I'm going to punch up the midtone contrast to the middle, and where the slider that says balance below here, one direction it lightens those midtones and the other direction it darkens. So lighten to the left, darken to the right, which is opposite of, everywhere else, like your curves and your levels and so on. So I can add contrast to the midtones. Okay, I can add contrast to the shadows. Look at that. That's great. And I can add contrast to the highlights. So I can darken the highlights and bring them down like that. So see what that tool is doing, and it's giving me more control of to where I've placed my contrast, right? I still find the image is a little blue, so I'm going to go back in here because I adjusted the white balance, okay? And I'm going to change it to landscape under the profile, right? Let me undo that again. Okay, so Luminar default, okay, versus, look at the difference, camera, landscape, right? Change the color. And then just punching up this a little bit, right? Much warmer. Because I find these trees, they shouldn't be bluish, right? They should be more green. And I'm going to do a dance with this one here. I think I need more yellow over here. And scale that back a little bit. Okay. An edge vignette, which I do on pretty much everything. And I'm just going to do it overall. Make it fairly dark. Okay. There we go. Okay, now my eye is starting to go to that red tree, that orange tree, right? Because that's where I really want people to look, right? So I'm going to make this vignette smaller. And I'm going to position it around this tree so I can focus on this part of the image. Like so. And I think the last thing I would do to this one is my favorite mystical filter to finish it off around 24, maybe even more. Ooh, this one looks good with mystical. Look at that. So this is a very dramatic image, and there's lots of detail there. Okay, I believe it's a raw file. I think so. Yep, raw file. Right, so there's lots of room here and lots of latitude in the detail in the file to pull this out. So let's take a look at the before and after. Okay, before is very, very flat, and after we can really punch that up. Right. You could also add again, this starts to tie into, we can keep going forever on an image. We can add a LUT here. And part of the reason that I like to try LUTs is it changes the look and appearance of your image. Okay, so you can see that these are adding even more contrast, but they also have like a cinematic color tone. And I know that I'm looking for one that has sort of more orange and brown. Wooden, smoky is actually one of my favorites. Okay, look what that does. Look how dramatic that is, right? That's fantastic. If I want to dial the contrast back a little bit, right? I really like what that's doing. Really like what that's doing. Beautiful. All right, let's see if we have any questions. And Regender's here. Awesome. And I'll come back to your question in a moment. And yes, the Regender, I would have tried dehaze, but you can see how I have a little bit more control over that. Absolutely, that's why I want that orange tree to stand out for sure. Made you stop the vehicle to shoot it during your trip. Yes, I would have stopped the car too. Ask Rob. There's been occasions when I almost jumped out of the car. You can ask him. Yes, photographers are a weird bunch, right? Something else I might choose to add here is actually a sun rays. Okay, so the light is strongly coming from the side. If I add a little bit of a sun ray here, and I'm just going to show you the possibility for a moment here, right? If I place the sun center off of the image, okay, so right over here, let's even have it coming from like the side, right? Like so. And then I can play around with literally just the number of sun rays and the randomizer, which I really love. And I find that it gives you an option to do things like this that are just super dramatic, right? Playing around with this so that light is hitting that tree. Oh, I had one that was good. Oh, I'm just trying to get it so that it looks like the beam of light. There we go. Oops. I gotta find the right one. It's a game of inches here. Okay, that's not bad. There we go. And then I can mask it. I can change the overall look of the image. I can do less rays, but I can lower it in terms of the amount and mask it so that it only is applying on certain areas. Like maybe I don't want it applying. I just want those beams of light to hit in the middle section there. Okay, so I don't want it going down here. Just want it in the middle, like so. All right. So there's a few ideas for you in terms of, you know, we've got original, tons of information there, right? Okay, so a bunch of questions have come in. Is it better to do a LUT after you did all those changes or before? I generally sort of do a LUT at the end, Nigel, because for me it's like finishing it off. It's the mood, it's the tone of the image. Let me just choose a different one here just to show you the difference. Okay, so I like wooden a lot as well. Okay, so it gives it a very different look, and I can change it up in terms of, you know, what I'm applying here, right? And change the look of the image very quickly at the end. So I generally do it at the end. Ooh, look at that one. Okay, red trace. It really pulls out that red tree. So we could go with something like that as well. Cool. Yes, great question. And I know that Anne had a question earlier. Okay, let me just scroll back here. Can you demonstrate the graduated filter? Okay, yes, I will go back and do that. All right, let me see where I would use a graduated filter. Okay, so this is actually one I was going to demonstrate next week. No, I was going to do that this week. Okay, so yeah, let me demonstrate. Where are we? I'm not going to get to all the ones I had scheduled for today, but that's okay. We're learning lots. Okay, so this is a great example of when I would use a graduated filter. Okay, so a graduated filter is something that you can actually apply in front of the lens. So it goes from dark on the edge of the filter to clear to dark in the sky. Okay, but the problem with using it in camera is, I'll show you by applying it here in Lightroom. When you apply it from the edge down, okay, so let's just say I want to apply a filter that's dark and highlights down, which is happening here. Okay, so when I drag the filter onto the image, okay, I'm just going to do it with a small variation of tone. So the further apart I drag these lines, the more faded it is. So I'm going to leave them close together just to show you what happens, okay? And I'm going to go to an extreme. So when you do a graduated filter and you put it in front of your lens, okay, look what happens to the trees, okay? So anything that is in that line gets darkened, and there's no way to not darken the trees, okay? But in Lightroom, we do have a way to fix that. Okay, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit. So I want to blend it sort of up to the horizon. I'm not going to go as extreme, okay, but I definitely want to darken. So I'm going to darken as opposed to just take the highlights down. And I'm going to add a little bit of clarity. Okay, so clarity really sort of punches up the sky. Let's give it a bit of contrast and even saturation in this case. Okay, maybe a little bit of pink. So I can shift even the color of the sky and make it more of a sunset. Okay, so we can really apply lots of different things, but it's all applying to that tree. Okay, so you see where it's the mask, I'm hitting O. Go down to the bottom of this tool and see where it says range mask, and I'm going to choose luminance. Okay, so this creates what's called a luminosity or a luminance mask, and I'm going to show it, and I want to take it off this tree area. Okay, so the sliders down here where it says range is like the histogram, dark on the left, light on the right. So as I drag this one up, it means it's not applying to the darkest areas of the image. So it's taking it, you see, off the tree. So without masking, I can just use this little slider here to get it off the tree. So when I go back to the image, right, now you can see that what I'm applying, right, see how it's not applying to the tree now? Is basically masking the tree out for me. Okay, so that's that luminosity mask as part of any of the filters. Okay. So yes, the graduated filter is a software version of an actual filter. Correct. The luminance thingy. Yes, that's the technical term, Anne. So I'm actually going to hop over to Luminar again and get that same image. Oops, yikes. All right, there we go. My mouse went crazy. I'm going to get that same image, and I'm going to try a few things in Luminar here, and I think this will be our last one for today. So I'm going to straighten the horizon with this little button here. Okay, so you can see that it's now straightened everything. And I'm not crazy about this sort of thing on the left or on the right here, so I'm going to crop in a little bit more. Right. So I think what they were going for here was this row of these wires pointing off into the horizon. Okay, I think that's what they were going for. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter. And now I'm just going to go up to Enhance AI again. So this is the one that you could start with. And the Sky Enhancer. Okay, so it's really smart because it recognizes where the sky is, right? So I don't have to replace the sky here. I just need to enhance it. Okay? So look at that. Really quickly, I can do the same thing with the sky without any masking, without any mucking around. I'm going to add a edge vignette here. And then I'm going to go to that super contrast tool again. I use this one a lot. So for those of you that are using Luminar and you're not using the super contrast tool, try it out. Because what I want to do is I want to darken the sky. Okay, so I've already done that a bit with the enhance. I can go into the light panel and bring the highlights down. Okay, but it's going to bring the highlights down on everything. Okay, I can also go into the color panel and play with the HSL tools. Okay, change them to luminance. Luminance is brightness. Okay, I can try blue, which darkens the sky. I'm going to darken the sky a little bit. But I also want to darken these trees here. Now you'll notice that the trees, look at, mostly yellow. Okay, so you would think green, but you would be surprised. Okay, so the grass is more green than the trees. Okay, so I'm going to darken these trees. Maybe I'll lighten the grass. Let's lighten the grass. And so on. So I can also play with the foliage enhancer. But now I'm going to go back to that super contrast that I mentioned. Okay, so I've done quite a bit of tone control already with the highlights. But this highlight contrast one, I just love how it works on the skies especially. Okay? Because look what happens. I can really dial in the sky and darken those highlights. Okay? See how that works? Specifically. Okay? I can add that mid-tone contrast and overall punch that's sort of missing. And you'll notice that when I do this, look at the image, okay? So the saturation has now increased. So be very careful of when you're punching things up. Remember how I said you add black, you get saturation? Be very careful that you don't go over the top, especially with the sky, okay? Because you don't want a sky that looks like that. It's too fake, okay? You want a sky that looks a bit more believable and a bit more natural. So really quickly in Luminar, I've gone from that to that. Okay. I could also just try a template because I find that the templates often get you really close. Okay. Let's see what it comes up with. It wants to do nature. Okay, let's see. So punching up the contrast a lot. Interesting. Landscapes. There we go. All right, let's try sunset. So whenever you choose a template, it is going to write over all the other things that I've done. So I generally go to templates first, right? Because I want to see what they do first, and then I'll tweak it. Okay. I'm going to go back here to undo that template. Okay. So it is now 1:30 where I am. Let me come back on the screen here. It's 1:30 where I am. Let me see if there's any questions. We've done quite a bit of editing today. Aaron is a Luminar convert. Excellent. I have to leave as well, and we've got some things to do. I will see you guys again next week. If you have images that you would like me to edit, do please send them in through the description area in the forum. There's a link to the forum right below the video. Send in your images, and if you have specific things that you'd like addressed with an image, please let me know that in the forum when you fill it out and send them. So until next time, take care, get outside and enjoy the sun if it's beautiful where you are, and I'll see you next week.